Have you ever wondered why the people who mock you in the daylight are the first to knock on your door in the dark? It's strange, isn't it, how quickly laughter can sour into pleading. That afternoon, the house was full of it. Laughter, sharp, brittle, and aimed directly at her like pins thrown at a soft target. Marissa stood in the kitchen doorway clutching a folded dish towel, the smell of garlic and oil clinging to her hair. They were at the dining table, her husband's sisters, their mother, even her own cousin who had somehow been adopted into their little tribunal. Talking about money, about the trouble, one of them was in about solutions. She had listened for 15 minutes before quietly offering, "If you need, I can help." The words had barely left her lips before they burst out laughing. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, the kind that comes from disbelief, superiority, that subtle venom people reserve for someone they think is beneath them. "Help, oh Marissa," the eldest sister said, tilting her head like she was talking to a child who just announced she could lift a car. "That's sweet, but we're talking real numbers here." The others joined in. "She doesn't even manage her own bank account without asking permission." One of them smirked. Another added, "Her little savings probably wouldn't cover a coffee run for a week." "And if you were in her place, would you have defended yourself, or would you have swallowed it like she did?" Her lips pressed into a line so thin it almost disappeared. She didn't answer them. She just went back to the kitchen. But something shifted in her. That quiet, simmering place deep inside where humiliation collects like rainwater. You know the one. The place where you keep every cutting remark, every time you were underestimated, every time they spoke to you like you were furniture. They went on with their conversation, voices rising, laughter spilling into the hallway. And Marissa, invisible in the kitchen's dim light, began to see them differently, not as the powerful family she had married into, but as people who were terrified of sinking and desperately clinging to the illusion of control. The golden daughter, the unyielding matriarch, the sharp-tongued survivor, all of them just archetypes, paper masks hiding their cracks. She stayed silent. That was her first act of power. Days passed. The problem they'd been discussing, a looming debt that could collapse a business, became more urgent. Meetings in hushed voices, phone calls behind closed doors. She noticed her husband coming home with tight lines around his mouth. Still, no one came to her, until the day the bank notice arrived. It was a Sunday late afternoon, the kind of heavy summer heat that makes everything feel slow. She was pruning the roses in the front yard when her sister-in-law's car screeched to a stop at the curb. The woman got out still in her church dress, makeup streaked from sweat. She didn't bother with greetings. "Marissa, we need to talk." You know that moment when someone who's always looked down on you suddenly can't meet your eyes, when the air between you shifts and you realize they're about to step over a line they swore they'd never cross. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had been mocked, and the words came tumbling out. They needed money, a lot of it, the kind of money they'd scoffed at her ever having. Marissa listened. No interruptions, no visible reaction. Her stillness unnerved them. You'd think it's anger that frightens people most, but it isn't. It's calm. The kind of calm that says, "I've already decided." When they finished their pitch, promises of repayment, gratitude, future respect, she let the silence stretch until it hurt. Then she said softly, "No." It was like slamming a door in their faces without moving a muscle. Their expressions twisted, first shock, then disbelief, then something uglier. They reminded her of that afternoon, their laughter echoing in her ears, but this time the sound was replaced by the rasp of their breath, the crack in their voices. "No, but you said." "I offered once," she said, her voice steady as a stone, "and you laughed." And there it was, the shift. The begging began. The arrogance drained out of them, replaced with desperation. They reached for her hands, leaned closer, their words tumbling over each other. Promises, pleas, thinly veiled accusations. But Marissa just watched. And for the first time she realized that their power over her had never been real. It had only existed because she allowed it. They kept talking as if she might change her mind if they just found the right word. If you have ever watched a person try to rearrange the past with apologies they should have given years ago, you know that tone. It was syrupy and frantic. It was the sound of people who finally understood the cost of their own pride. Marissa poured water into 3 glasses and set them down without ceremony. It struck her that this was the first time any of them had looked closely at her hands. Always they had looked at what she carried. The casserole dish, the diaper bag, the folding chair she brought to every game and sat on at the far end of the field. Now they saw the veins, the steadiness, the hands of someone who builds slowly and does not announce it. You would have been tempted to explain yourself right, to say where the money had come from, to win their awe and rewrite your role. But she did not. Explanation is a currency people demand when they think your life belongs to them. She owed them nothing. The begging softened into strategy. The eldest sister cleared her throat and tried a different key. "We miss how close we used to be." That line might have worked on a younger version of Marissa, the one who used to bake extra cupcakes for her niece's school fundraiser and got told the frosting was too sweet. The one who offered childcare during tax season and was told she should worry about her own housekeeping. The one who dropped off a casserole after the matriarch's minor surgery and was informed it was too spicy, then watched the dish scraped clean. She remembered vividly the first time the family taught her the pecking order. It was a winter dinner years ago. She had set the table careful with the good plates. The mother-in-law had walked the perimeter like a general on inspection and finally nodded at the silverware. "At least you can do this," she said, a compliment that was not a compliment at all. You know that genre praise that nails your feet to one spot. Back then, Marissa worked nights at a small accounting office. She liked the quiet hours, the rhythm of numbers that either balanced or did not. No one in the family really asked about it. They assumed bookkeeping was hobby grade. They assumed that when she said she enjoyed spreadsheets, she meant she enjoyed coloring them. She had asked her husband once if she should try for the certification exam. He had smiled in that way that is not cruel but careful. "Why make yourself miserable?" he said. So she stopped speaking ambitions out loud and planted them instead. What they never knew was that the boss who valued her precision had left her a lifeline when he retired. He handed her a small portfolio of clients who preferred plain competence over showmanship. They paid on time. They recommended her quietly. She took no days off, but she took control. Every invoice tracked, every invoice honored, every dollar with a purpose. She called it her river beneath the floorboards. You listening, you might be thinking this is a revenge story about money. It is not. Money is just the surface of it. This is a story about the day a quiet mother stops auditioning for everyone else's approval. You feel that pressure in your chest, do you not? The urge to disappear into usefulness. The urge to be the person who never makes waves. And then one day, you find your lungs. The sisters tried guilt next. "We are family," one said, as if the word itself were a legally binding contract. The matriarch finally spoke, voice dry as paper. "You married my son. Our fortune is your fortune. Your fortune is ours." The sentence wobbled at the end, as if she herself could feel the thinness of it. Family had always meant one thing here. Family meant Marissa gave, and they received. Family meant they corrected her, and she thanked them for the lesson. Marissa looked towards the hallway where a framed school portrait hung. Her son Mateo, gap-toothed and grinning, the collar of his shirt just slightly askew because he hated tight buttons. Everything she had done in the last 4 years had been for two people. The woman she had promised herself she would become. The boy who watched every gesture and learned what a woman was allowed to do. She turned back and said, "I will not be participating in the bailout." The word participating landed like a rock dropped into a well. It was neutral and final. You know that tone. It is the tone therapists try to teach you when you are done justifying your boundary. No explanations, no long footnotes, just the choice. Faces hardened. The eldest sister's mouth went thin. The mother dabbed at the corner of her eye with a napkin that smelled of perfume and starch. The cousin tried one last bargain. "You can name your terms." The door to the house creaked somewhere behind them, and her husband stepped in. He stopped short, reading the room the way a man reads the weather right before a storm. His gaze ricocheted from Marissa to his family. "Risa," he began softly, using the shortened name he reserved for reconciliation. "Maybe we can help a little. We do not want them to lose everything." She met his eyes. For years, she had bent herself into the shape of his comfort. There is a point where you understand that someone else's comfort can be the most expensive thing you ever pay for. "We will not be helping," she said. "Not this way." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He was remembering something, and so was she. The night 2 summers ago, when he had misplaced a sizable amount in an investment his sister swore would double by fall. He had told Marissa not to worry about it. He had told her not to be dramatic. She had asked to see the paperwork, and he had laughed, called her adorable. Adorable like a puppy pawing at a newspaper. Now he looked ready to plead on behalf of everyone at the table. She thought of the roses out front. How they pricked you when you reached too fast. "No," she repeated, a soft blade. You watching this, you might feel the thrill and the terror of that word. You might feel the air clear. She felt it too. The house tilted a few degrees, and for once it tilted in her favor. The silence that followed wasn't really silence. It was the low, almost inaudible hum of a room recalibrating itself. Chairs shifted. Someone's breath caught. A fork tapped against the rim of a glass, then stilled. You've felt that moment before, haven't you? When the usual script is torn up and everyone is stranded without their lines. The mother-in-law, who had always held herself like a queen in exile, straightened and attempted her most regal expression. "Marissa," she said slowly, as though speaking to someone who didn't understand the language, "we are talking about the survival of a family business, your son's inheritance, his name." Marissa leaned back slightly, the edge of her chair pressing into her spine. "I'm aware," she said. No flinch, no apology. She let the weight of the pause afterward press against them like a closed door. You might think it cruel, this refusal, but cruelty would have been giving them exactly what they wanted and letting them learn nothing. Sometimes kindness wears the mask of denial. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who live off others is to let them face the hunger. Her husband shifted in his seat. "We can't just stand by," he said, but the conviction in his voice was frayed. He wasn't defending them so much as defending the man he thought he was, the generous son, the dependable brother. The man who believed keeping the family afloat was the same thing as keeping it whole. Marissa thought of the last time she had helped in the way they wanted. It had been 3 years earlier when her own car had been barely functional and she'd still agreed to co-sign a loan for her brother-in-law's failing cafe. He had stopped answering her calls within 6 months. The cafe closed anyway. At Christmas, he had handed her a scented candle with a grin and said, "It's the thought that counts." That candle still sat under her sink unlit. This right now was not about the money. It was about the architecture of the family, the hierarchy they had built so carefully, them at the top, her at the bottom. She could hand over every cent she had, and tomorrow they would find another way to remind her she didn't belong on their level. The cousin spoke up then, her voice sharp, trying to slice the tension. "We're all struggling, Marissa. This is no time to be selfish." That word, selfish. How quickly it comes out when a woman stops bleeding herself dry for other people. You've heard it before, haven't you? When you say no to overtime, that's unpaid. When you refuse to host the holiday dinner after hosting for 10 straight years. When you tell someone you won't watch their child for free every weekend. Selfish is their way of telling you they've lost their favorite resource. Marissa's gaze slid to the window where the sun was catching the edge of the roses again, making each thorn glint like a tiny blade. "Selfish," she repeated softly as if tasting the word for the first time. "Maybe I've earned the right." The mother-in-law's lips tightened. "You've changed," she said. "Yes," Marissa replied. "I have." You see, they wanted her to believe that change was a betrayal. But what it really was evolution. And evolution once begun does not reverse. Her husband finally spoke again, this time to his sisters. His mother, the cousin. "I think we should give her decision some respect," he said, though it sounded more like a truce than an alliance. They turned on him next, each in their own way, disappointment manipulation, quiet threats about what this would mean for his standing in the family. He looked at Marissa then as though asking silently, "Are you sure?" And here's where you must understand her. She wasn't just sure. She was finished. Finished with the little cuts, the condescension, the laughter that always came when she dared to offer something of herself. She had kept a ledger in her mind all these years, and the balance had shifted so far it would take a miracle or an earthquake to tilt it back. She stood slowly. Not to leave, not yet. Just to put herself at her full height. "I hope you find what you need," she said, voice steady, "but it will not be mine." Her chair scraped softly against the floor as she pushed it in. She didn't wait for anyone to follow her. In the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of water, her movements deliberate. She could feel the eyes on her back from the dining room. The murmurs began again, low and heated. She didn't need to hear the words to know what they were rewriting the story so they could live with it. In their version, she was cold, ungrateful, possibly insane. She took her water and walked to the front porch. The air outside was cooler now, the heat of the day bleeding away. Across the street, a neighbor was watering her plants, nodding politely. The world, it turned out, hadn't ended. Inside, the voices were rising again, the storm she had chosen not to step into. She realized with a clarity that surprised her that she had thought this moment would feel heavier, that there would be guilt. But there wasn't. Just a strange, calm emptiness, the kind you feel after you finally set down something you'd been carrying too long. And maybe you know this feeling too, the first breath after the weight is gone. They didn't leave right away. Of course they didn't. People like that never retreat cleanly. They circle looking for cracks, for any hint that you'll soften if they just press the right bruise. From the porch, Marissa could hear them chairs scraping, voices sharpening, someone's glass clinking too hard against the table. The eldest sister's voice cut through the murmur, carrying that same mix of indignation and disbelief. She can't possibly mean it. She's just flustered. We'll give her a few minutes. You've been in that position, haven't you? When your refusal is treated like a tantrum instead of a decision. When they tell themselves you'll come around because they can't imagine a world where you don't. But Marissa wasn't flustered. She was done. And done is different. Done doesn't slam doors, it locks them quietly. She sipped her water, the condensation cooling her fingers, and thought about the irony. They had laughed at her because they thought she couldn't help. Now they were furious because she wouldn't. Either way, it wasn't about her capacity. It was about her compliance. That was the currency here. That was what they'd always demanded. The door opened behind her. It was her husband standing halfway between the living room and the porch, his shadow spilling out across the floorboards. "They're saying we should talk in private," he said. "We are in private," she replied without turning. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about the past. This is about right now. If we don't step in, they'll lose everything. And whether you like them or not, that affects us. It affects Mateo." There it was, the trump card. The child, the future, the leverage they thought she couldn't resist. She set her glass down carefully. "You mean it affects you," she said. "You're standing with them. Your role in their stories. Mateo doesn't need a piece of a crumbling business. He needs parents who aren't afraid to teach him what boundaries look like." He blinked as though she'd spoken in a language he hadn't heard before. "You're making this personal." "It is personal," she said. "Everything that drains me is personal." You might think she was being cruel here too. But if you've ever been drained to the bone by people who call it love, you understand. There's a point where you stop trying to be good in their eyes and start trying to be whole in your own. Inside, someone laughed, a short, bitter sound, and the cousin's voice rose. "She'll regret this. Just wait until she needs something from us." Marissa almost smiled. The idea that she might one day crawl back to them was the thread they were clinging to now, the way a drowning person clings to debris. But she knew something they didn't. She had built her life so carefully these past years that she didn't need what they offered, not their money, not their approval, not their table to sit at. Her husband's jaw tightened. "I can't go back in there and tell them we're doing nothing," he said. "Then don't," she said simply. "Tell them you are doing nothing. My decision doesn't have to be yours. But if you give them what they want, understand this, you'll be giving it without me." That landed. You could feel it in the air, the way it went still. Because that was the part he hadn't considered, that her refusal wasn't a negotiation tactic, it was the boundary line, and crossing it had consequences. He looked at her for a long moment as if searching for the woman he thought he knew. But she was no longer in the role he had cast her in, and she wasn't stepping back into it. Finally, he exhaled. "They're going to talk about you," he said almost gently. "They've been talking about me for years," she replied. "This time, they'll just have to do it without my permission." She picked up her glass again, took another slow sip, and turned her gaze to the street. A child rode by on a bicycle, laughing, the sound ringing clear in the evening air. Life in its ordinary way kept moving. Behind them, the door shut. Whether her husband had gone back in to defend her or surrender to them, she didn't know. And for the first time, she realized she didn't need to. The outcome inside those walls no longer determined her worth. That's the thing they never tell you about breaking the pattern. Once you step outside it, the noise fades faster than you expect. You think you'll hear it forever, but you don't. You hear the wind, the clink of ice in your glass, the rustle of leaves. You hear your own breathing, steady and sure. And maybe if you've been there yourself, you know that's the sweetest sound of all. The evening dragged on the light outside, fading into that deep, bruised blue that makes everything sharper. From her seat on the porch, Marissa could see the faint glow spilling from the dining room window, figures moving hands, gesturing wildly, the choreography of a family trying to salvage control. She didn't get up. Not when the cousin stormed past her without so much as a glance, muttering something under her breath. Not when the eldest sister followed, car keys in hand, snapping at someone still inside. The tires screeched a little as they pulled away, as if the sound might be their parting shot. The mother-in-law was the last to leave. She stepped onto the porch with the same rigid posture she always carried, but there was a faint tremor in her hand as she adjusted her purse strap. She paused at the top of the steps. "You'll regret this, Marissa." She said, her voice low but steady. "Maybe not today, but one day you'll find yourself needing what only family can give." Marissa didn't stand. She just looked at her, the porch light catching the small lines around the older woman's eyes. Family, she said softly, isn't supposed to make you regret saying no. For the first time in years, the matriarch didn't have a ready reply. She turned heels clicking against the wood and walked away. You've had moments like that, haven't you, where the conversation is over, not because everyone agrees, but because you've removed yourself as a participant in the old game. The finality doesn't need shouting. It sits there between you, quiet but immovable. The house was silent once they were gone. Her husband didn't speak right away. When he finally did, it was from the doorway. They won't forgive you, he said, as if this was the worst fate imaginable. They don't have to, Marissa replied. He hesitated, then joined her on the porch. He didn't reach for her hand. They just sat there, the gap between them wider than the 2 feet of wood that separated their chairs. It's not going to be easy after this, he said. She turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. It's been easy for them for too long. That night she lay awake in bed long after he'd fallen asleep. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. She thought about the first dinner she'd ever attended here years ago, when she was still just the girlfriend eager to please. She'd worn a dress she couldn't afford and brought a bottle of wine she'd researched for days. They'd smiled, nodded, and then moved on as if she were an interchangeable accessory. The truth was, she'd been waiting all these years for a moment like tonight, not consciously, but deep down. A moment where they would give her the chance to prove to herself that she was no longer that girl who mistook being tolerated for being loved. You might imagine she'd felt triumphant, but it wasn't that. It was quieter, more grounded. The way a tree might feel after a storm has stripped away every dead branch, leaving only what can still grow. In the days that followed, the fallout began. One by one, mutual friends and distant relatives called, some pretending to check in, others fishing for her version of events. She didn't give them much, just enough to make it clear she wasn't hiding, and no more. People who thrive on gossip hate that. It gives them nothing to twist. Her husband grew restless under the weight of it all. At night, he'd bring up scenarios. What if they cut Mateo out of family gatherings? What if they started spreading lies about her? What if? And she would answer the same way every time, then we'll deal with it. You see, the power they had over her was never in what they did. It was in what she feared they might do. Once you stop fearing the consequence, the threat dissolves. The first Saturday without them came like any other. Morning light coffee on the porch, Mateo playing with toy cars at her feet. She felt the ghost of old habits, the urge to check her phone for messages, to see if anyone was extending an olive branch, even a thorny one. But she didn't. She let the silence stretch, and with every hour that passed, it began to feel less like absence and more like space. By evening, she realized something that made her laugh, not the brittle laugh they used, but a real one. For the first time in years, she had an entire weekend with no obligations to anyone who drained her. No phone calls that began with, "Could you just?" No sudden errands disguised as emergencies. She sat at the kitchen table, the same one where the mockery had first cut into her. The wood grain was warm under her fingers. In that moment, she understood they could talk about her. They could shun her. They could even hate her. But they could not use her anymore. And once someone cannot use you, their version of you becomes irrelevant. Weeks passed, and the absence of their voices in her daily life became less of an ache and more of a relief, the way a wound stops throbbing when you finally stop touching it. The phone still rang sometimes, but now the numbers lighting up the screen were easy to ignore. A distant cousin asking for just a quick favor. An aunt with a problem that only you can fix. Each one went to voicemail, their urgency melting into the digital void. Her husband had stopped pushing, not because he agreed with her necessarily, but because he could see she was immovable. He'd learned perhaps for the first time that there was no point in trying to negotiate with someone who had already counted the cost and paid it in full. One evening, as summer tipped into autumn, Marissa sat in the living room with Mateo on her lap, reading him a story about a fox who outwits a pack of wolves. He interrupted halfway through, his small hand pressing against her cheek. "Mom," he said seriously, "you're like the fox." She laughed, but inside, something twisted not from pain, but recognition. He had been watching. Children always are. They notice who bends, who breaks, who stands still when the wind howls. And they learn. Oh, they learn. If you've ever had a child or someone younger who looks to, this truth, the boundaries you keep become the map they follow. If she'd caved that night, Mateo would have learned that family's demands outweigh self-respect. Instead, he was learning that love can exist without surrendering the marrow of who you are. In October, she passed the cafe that her brother-in-law had once owned. The windows were boarded, now the sign faded to a dull shadow of its old self. She didn't feel smug. She felt nothing. That was the real victory, indifference, the opposite of being tangled in their approval or their failure. It was around that time the first rumor reached her. A neighbor not unkind but eager in the way people are when they have a warning to deliver told her that the family was saying she had changed since she got money. The words were almost laughable, as though the money was new, as though it was the cause of her backbone instead of the quiet reward for having one all along. You've heard that tone before, haven't you? When people can't frame your growth in a way that doesn't make them look small, they blame an external thing. Money, a new friend, a phase, anything but the truth that you simply stopped letting them decide who you were. By November, the business they'd been so desperate to save was gone. Sold off in pieces, the debt scattered like shrapnel across multiple names. They didn't call her to tell her. She heard it from a mutual friend. And even then, she didn't reach out. It wasn't cruelty. It was trust, that they were capable of surviving their own choices without her as their net. Then one rainy Tuesday, her phone buzzed with a number she recognized immediately, the eldest sister. No message this time, just the call. She let it ring out. A minute later, it rang again. And again. 3 times in total, as if repetition might force her hand. She didn't answer. Not out of spite, but because the version of her who would have answered didn't live here anymore. That woman had been polite to the point of erasure. This woman was something else entirely. You might be wondering if she ever planned to reconcile. If she thought in the quiet corners of her mind about some grand holiday truce, a moment where they'd embrace and start fresh. But the truth was simpler. She didn't need reconciliation. She needed peace, and she already had it. One evening in December, she stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes when her husband came in, coat still damp from the rain. He hesitated before speaking. "They're hosting Christmas Eve," he said carefully. "They asked if we're coming." She dried her hands on a towel, looked at him, and smiled faintly. "You and Mateo can go if you want." "You're not coming." "No," she said, turning back to the sink. "I've given them enough of my holidays." And here's the thing, she wasn't angry anymore. The thought of them didn't churn her stomach or clench her fists. She could imagine them together, the small digs, the exaggerated laughter, the stories told at someone else's expense, and feel nothing but distance. The kind of distance you can't fake. That night, as she tucked Mateo into bed, he asked, "Will there be presents there?" "Yes," she said, smoothing his hair. "But remember, presents aren't the same as presents." He nodded like he understood, and maybe in his way he did. And if you've walked away from a table that kept serving you scraps, know this feeling well, the quiet satisfaction of knowing you will never again sit there hungry, pretending it's enough. January arrived with a brittle cold that seemed to seep into everything. But inside Marissa's home there was a different kind of warmth, not loud, not forced, but steady. The kind that comes from knowing you've stripped away what was draining you and nothing collapsed in your absence. She'd expected in some small corner of herself that the family's silence might eventually thaw, that someone would send a message framed as a peace offering, maybe under the guise of checking on Mateo. But nothing came. And the absence, she realized, was its own kind of gift. They weren't calling because they no longer saw her as a resource. And that was exactly the point. You've felt that, haven't you? That strange mix of relief and revelation when you understand that being cut off by people who only valued what you could give is not punishment, it's liberation. Her husband still carried a certain heaviness, not anger exactly, but the discomfort of being between two worlds. She could feel it in the way he sometimes lingered on the porch, before coming inside, phone in hand, scrolling messages he didn't read aloud. Once she caught a glimpse, a thread of complaints, the family rewriting the story so that Marissa had abandoned them in their hour of need. She didn't tell him to stop reading. She didn't tell him to defend her. Some battles are meant to be walked past entirely. In February, she got an email from an old client, one of the first she'd taken on when she started building her river beneath the floorboards. They referred her to someone else and then another. By spring, her work had quietly doubled, not in a way that overwhelmed her, but in a way that affirmed what she already knew: she had been underestimated for years by the very people who mocked her offers of help. You might think she would want to tell them, to prove them wrong with numbers, with evidence. But the sweetest victories are the ones you don't announce. The kind where you sit alone in your office, glance at the balance sheet, and smile to yourself because you know, and only you know, just how wrong they were. The first time she saw one of them again was by accident. She was in the market debating between 2 brands of olive oil when she heard the unmistakable voice of her eldest sister-in-law in the next aisle. She considered slipping away unseen, but then thought better of it. Why should she hide? They nearly bumped carts turning the corner. The other woman froze for a fraction of a second, then plastered on a smile. Marissa, it's been ages. Yes, Marissa said, her voice calm. It has. There was small talk, stilted surface level, about the weather, about how much Mateo must have grown. Then came the inevitable tilt, the way some people lean forward when they're testing if they still have access to you. We should get together soon, catch up, maybe talk things over. Marissa met her eyes, and for a moment the other woman faltered. I don't think that's necessary, she said evenly, but I wish you well. That was it. No apology sought, no doorway cracked open, just a boundary that had roots now deep enough that nothing could push it over. By summer, she had stopped marking the months since that night in the dining room. The moment had become less of a wound and more of a marker, the place in the road where she'd turned away from something that no longer fit. One humid evening, sitting on the back steps while Mateo chased fireflies, her husband joined her. He didn't speak at first, just watched their son dart across the lawn. Finally, he said, "You were right. They would have taken everything we had and it still wouldn't have been enough." She didn't gloat, she just nodded. "I know." He glanced at her. "You've changed." She smiled faintly, the fireflies flickering in the dark. "I've stopped asking for permission to be myself." And maybe this is the part you've been waiting for, the reconciliation, the grand emotional climax. But life doesn't always give you those neat endings. Sometimes the resolution is quieter. The space you've carved for yourself stays intact. The people who once drained you find other wells to tap, and you move on without the need for applause. By autumn, her world had narrowed to the people who mattered: Mateo, a few close friends, clients who valued her work. The noise was gone. The expectations were gone. And in their place was something she hadn't had in years: peace without condition. One evening she walked past the mirror in the hallway and caught her reflection. There was no trace of the woman who had once stood in the kitchen doorway, dish towel in hand, hoping to be taken seriously. That woman had been replaced by someone who knew exactly what she was worth and no longer felt the need to prove it. The woman who knows her worth doesn't beg, she watches. Then she rises.